The following presentation is part of the Technology and the Corporation Conference Series, sponsored by MIT's Industrial Liaison Program.
Thanks, Don. Welcome, everybody. I'm going to focus on the impact of the business environment on manufacturing and supply chain strategies. I will start with a few observations. The first observation is that a large number of at least US executives are either talking or changing their manufacturing strategies by moving back production operations to the US. A couple of examples that have been discussed in the media. Ford announced in 2010 that the company is bringing back thousands of manufacturing jobs. Caterpillar is investing in a huge facility in Texas that will produce or already producing components that previously were produced in Japan. Decision makers in Washington, of course, support these moves. But if you look at what happened to the American manufacturing sector in the last few years, in fact, since 1997, we lost about 6 million jobs, a total or a drop of about 34% in the number of jobs in that sector. And if you look at the number of manufacturing facilities in the US, it dropped by about 17% during exactly the same period of time. And so the question that I want to start focusing on are the two examples that I have here, part of a general trend, or these are just unique examples that do not reflect what we see in the market. And at the same time, I want to focus a little bit on the statistics at the bottom and try to understand the discrepancy between the percentage of job lost and the percentage of number of facilities, plants closed. Is the difference due to improved productivity, or is the difference driven by the fact that when we see plants closed, it's mostly the large plants that are closed? And so the objective of this discussion is to start developing a framework that will help us answer some or all of these questions. I'm going to start with today's supply chain challenges, just to motivate the discussion, and then argue that the role of emerging markets is changing in a significant way from just low-cost manufacturing to where growth in revenue is coming from. And then talk about two important drivers of your manufacturing strategy. One is the impact of oil price, and the second one is the impact of taxation. And my objective is not to wave my hand and to say that as oil price increase, you need to change your strategy, but to build models that allow us to quantify the impact of oil price and to quantify the impact of different tax policies on your supply chain and manufacturing strategies. And I'll illustrate these models with two examples. One of a company in the consumer packaged good industry, and the other one is a manufacturer of building materials. As we go through the discussion, I will try to motivate an observation that what we are seeing is a new strategy, a move from global manufacturing strategy to a more regional strategy. And as a result, ask the question, can we develop a framework that will explain or project which industries are going to move manufacturing activities closer to market demand, and for which industry we are not going to see significant change, and then relate this to manufacturing in the US, try to understand whether this move to a regional manufacturing strategy also implies a change in manufacturing in this country. So let me start with today's supply chain challenges. I'm sure you're familiar with some that I have here. Global supply chain with long lead time, rising and shifting customer expectations, suggesting that on the one hand, it's difficult to predict customer demand. On the other hand, there is a lot of pressure to increase service level. Significant increase in labor costs in developing countries. If you look at a period of about 5 years, labor cost in China increased year over year by almost 20%. In Mexico, over the same period of time, year over year increase in labor costs is by, on average, of 5%, and in the US, by 3%. So if your company took production sourcing decisions 5, 7, maybe 8 years ago, you may need to revisit some or all of these decisions. Not only significant increase in labor costs in developing countries, significant change in logistics cost over the last few years. To illustrate this, I have here information about US logistics cost as a percentage of the US GDP over a period of about 25 years. As you can see, US logistics cost between 1984 and 2002 went continuously down, mostly because of improvement in supply chain strategies. But between 2003 and 2008, it increased and increased significantly. In 2009, we saw a reduction due to the recession, and now it's picking up again. And we understand where the increase is coming from. It's because of energy prices. It's because of limited rail capacity in the US, suggesting that not only rail transportation cost goes up, but also implying the shippers start shifting from rail to the trucking industry. As a result, transportation cost in general goes up. And if you ask, what did I include in logistics cost? What's included here is administrative cost, mostly the cost of IT, inventory cost, and transportation cost. Notice that this suggests that over a period of about 5 years, transportation cost increased by almost 50%, but inventory increased faster than transportation cost. Question, why is that? A number of reasons. One is the long lead time in the supply chain, implying more inventory, more product competing in the market, implying more inventory. But most importantly, notice that the line representing inventory cost moves in parallel to the line representing transportation cost. What does this mean? What do companies do when there is an increase in transportation cost? They try to take advantage of economies of scale by shipping large quantities. Shipping large quantities is great from transportation point of view, but it's a problem from inventory point of view. In addition to the increase in labor cost and logistics cost, we saw significant increase in the level of risk faced by many companies. And I would argue that this is precisely because of successful implementation of strategies like lean, like outsourcing, and like offshoring. What does lean mean? Lean implies low level of inventory. Low level of inventory suggests that if there is a disruption, the supply chain will not be able to match supply with demand. Outsourcing and offshoring implies that the supply chain is geographically more diverse, as a result, exposed to all sorts of potential problems. And these problems are nicely illustrated with events in 2011, the flood in Thailand and the tsunami in Japan. Just looking at last year, the impact of natural disaster on businesses in Japan, the impact of the tsunami was in excess of $220 billion, and the impact of the flood in Thailand was more than $30 billion. And if you take a historical perspective, and you look at the impact of natural disaster over a period of about 30 years, you see significant increase in the impact of natural disasters. Last year, the total effect of events like the tsunami, like the flood in Thailand and others, was about $300 billion. Only a small fraction of this, right? This is the blue part of the bar. Only a small fraction of it was covered by insurance. And so as labor costs increase, as logistics costs increase, as risk faced by many companies increase, the question is what type of strategies you need to use in order to deal with these challenges. Not only increase in labor costs and logistics costs and huge increase in risk, but also the importance of sustainability has increased. And finally, probably the most important development that we see in the market is enormous volatility in the market. And here I don't focus mostly on volatility in demand. That has been around for many years. I'm focusing more on volatility in supply, especially commodity prices. So let's take a few examples. Here is the first one. Here I'm looking at the price of oil over a period of about 20 years. What I'm doing, I'm measuring for every year the number of days the price of oil change up or down at least 5%. As you can see, in normal years, the number of days the price of oil change up or down at least 5% is 5 days, 10 days, no more than 15 days. But in 2008, the price of oil changed up and down at least 5% in 39 days. And the last time we saw that level of volatility was in 1990. What happened in 1990? This is the first Gulf War. And if you ask what happened between 2009 and 2011, the price of oil more than doubled. These are, of course, changes that companies need to think about because they may have an impact on their supply chain strategies. Later on, we'll try to quantify the impact of these, of the change in oil price on your supply chain strategy. But this is not only about oil price. You look commodity by commodity, enormous volatility. Here is information about the price of steel, the price of different types of iron, huge volatility. This year, I did some work with a manufacturing company in the energy space. They focus on commodities like copper and silver, enormous volatility. And so as you face this type of volatility and upward trend, you need to rethink some of your manufacturing and supply chain decisions. As a result, I typically summarize this introduction by saying executives like you face competition in an environment that is complex, that is uncertain, that is dynamically changing. You need to think carefully about your business and maybe manage it differently than what you did just a few years ago, 5 or 7 years ago. In addition to these changes, we also saw that the role of emerging market is starting to change. And to understand the change in the role that emerging markets are playing, I want to analyze data that I collected together with Accenture. This is data from 287 companies in various industries, from consumer product, industrial goods, chemicals, pharmaceutical. In terms of size, companies varies from small-sized companies, 250 million to 500 million, mid-sized companies, $1 to $5 billion to large-sized companies. Most of these companies were U.S. manufacturing companies. The first question that we asked was, where is your revenue coming from? So what I'm presenting here is the percentage of revenue generated in the US, right? This is the blue bar as a function of company size. And you can see the first observation, as company size increases, the percentage of revenue generated in the US decreases and decreases significantly. If you look at companies whose size is greater than $25 billion, you see only about 40% of the revenue generating on average generated in the US. The other surprise is that when you look at manufacturing, what I call manufacturing supply, this is where components and raw material are produced. Right? You see the same behavior. As the size of the company increases, less and less supply side or manufacturing supply is generated in the US. Of course, this observation here in this slide is related to the initial observation that I started with that suggested that large manufacturing companies started moving a lot of operations outside the US. This is the supply side. To see whether this is true, a member of my team collected data on the following. On the percentage of US plants close over a period of 20 years, between 1990 to 2010. And he did it by industry, and he did it by plant size, by establishment size. So for example, establishment size between 50 to 99, 250 to 499, and greater than 1,000 people in the establishment by industry. And you can see the important observation here is associated with the red numbers. Red numbers represent losses over 40%, right? 40%, 57%, 80%. And you can see these are all associated with large plants. Same observation that I started with. When we see plants are closing, typically it's associated with moving the large facilities associated with large companies outside the US, or just closing them and walking away. Going back to the data from that we collected with Accenture, I started focusing on large-size companies, companies whose size is at least $10 billion. And the next question was, where is your revenue coming from? What is the distribution by region? And you can see this is presented here. When I look at the blue bar, you can see that most of the revenue is coming from North America and Western Europe, but we can see a growing part starting to come from Latin America and Asia. Now look at the red bar. The red bar represents manufacturing supply. This says that, in fact, manufacturing supply, the distribution of manufacturing supply follows the same distribution of where revenue is coming from. In fact, for a lot of this large manufacturing, there is a balanced strategy where there is almost equality between what revenue I'm generating and how much manufacturing supply I'm receiving in different regions. Following that path, we try to understand what these companies think will happen in their demand, to their revenue, and to their procurement strategy, to manufacturing supply in the next 3 years. And you can see what happens, what at least they report they expect to happen in the next 3 years. What they are saying, growth in revenue is going to come from Latin America and Asia, while North America and Western Europe share of the revenue is going to drop significantly. And the same exact thing is happening with manufacturing supply. In some sense, what these companies are doing, they are adjusting their manufacturing supply to match changes in revenue. And so one interpretation of this is that there is a shift from a global manufacturing strategy to what I call a regional strategy, where, if you will, Asia is for Asia, Europe is for the European market, and maybe America is for North America. And this is true not only at the aggregated level. This is true when you look at different industries. I'm presenting here a couple of examples. Industrial goods, exactly the same behavior. You look at electrical and electronic equipment, exactly the same behavior. A move to a regional strategy where manufacturing supply typically follows where revenue is coming from. One way to test this was to look at historical data, to look at what happened in the last 10 years. And here I'm looking at one industry, the power tool industry. Look at what happened in 2002. 2002, revenue generated in North America accounted for 39%, while emerging markets account for 22%. But 7 years later, revenue in North America accounted for 27%, whereas emerging markets accounted for a significantly bigger share, 33%. And so historically, we are starting to see historically, we saw a significant change in the revenue, and the same for manufacturing supply. One question that always comes up is, how does one explain the move to a regional strategy? So I want to start by analyzing the impact of oil price, and I will illustrate the impact of oil price using an example from of a CPG company, and then switch and talk about the impact of tax rate, because as you move to a regional strategy, it's tempting to say this is going to typically move manufacturing back to the US. And of course, the biggest elephant in the room is the impact of incentives like tax rate. I want to understand what tax rates in different regions do to your manufacturing strategy. So let's start initially just by focusing on the impact of oil price. The way we did this, we collected data on oil price over multiple years, and we built a model, we built a tool that allow us to take information about oil price and to use it to calculate information about transportation cost. And then we applied this model to this CPG company with 3 manufacturing facilities, one in Philadelphia, one in Omaha, and one in Juarez, Mexico. The facility, the plant in Juarez, Mexico, is a low-cost manufacturing facility, and the one in Philadelphia is the high-cost facility. The transportation strategy for this company is very simple. Inbound from manufacturing facilities to distribution center is done with truckload carriers. And outbound from distribution centers all the way to retail outlets is done with smaller trucks. Capacity about half of that of the truckload carriers. 3 objectives to this study. First, what should be the structure of their supply chain? How many distribution centers, where to locate distribution centers? What should be the capacity of the different warehouses? Second, closely related to our discussion here, how to allocate production to the different facilities. And finally, what is the impact of oil price on the manufacturing and distribution strategy. So let's start just with an intuitive analysis and then try to quantify by using data from this company. So the intuition is very simple. As oil price increase, transportation become more expensive relative to inventory cost, relative to fixed facility cost, and relative to manufacturing cost. Right? That's very simple, but let's look at the detail. As oil price increase, it becomes more and more important to reduce outbound cost from distribution center to distribution centers to retail outlets. How can you do that? By becoming more regional, by increasing the number of distribution centers, even at the expense of facility cost and even the expense of inventory. Similarly, as oil price increase, it becomes more and more important to move manufacturing closer to market demand. Let's see what happens in this supply chain. First, I'm looking at oil price versus facility cost and inventory cost. On the left-hand side, I have the supply chain strategy when oil price is at $75 per barrel. You can see that in this case, we need 5 distribution centers. The locations are Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, New York, and Las Vegas. And then what I did sensitivity analysis to understand the impact of oil price as oil price increase on your distribution strategy. You can see that when oil price goes up from $75 to $100 per barrel, there is no change in the strategy. Same distribution strategy. As it continues to $125, there is no change in the strategy. But at $150, we have a tipping point where the company needs to change its distribution strategy, close the distribution center in Vegas and replace it with 3 distribution centers, one in New Mexico, one in LA, and one in Portland. And this strategy remains the same as you increase oil price. My point is, every company has a tipping point. Different companies, of course, different tipping points. This company tipping point is at 150. I did work for another company where the tipping point was at about 115. When it's 115, you tell yourself, I need to rethink my supply chain strategy. And in fact, it's not only about my supply chain strategy, it's also about my my manufacturing strategy. At $75 per barrel, most of the manufacturing is done in Mexico to reduce manufacturing costs. But as oil price increase, more and more manufacturing move to Omaha to become closer to market demand, right? So the intuition is that as oil price increase, and this, some people talked about this earlier in the morning. As oil price increase, we see a move to a more regional strategy. The question is, how close is this going to move to the US? Is this going to move all the way to the US? And this brings us to talk about the impact of taxation on your manufacturing strategy. To understand the impact of taxation on manufacturing strategy, I'll use an example of a company that produces and sells building materials. And my focus is on what I call tax-efficient supply chain. What is a tax-efficient supply chain? In a tax-efficient supply chain, the objective is not to minimize cost. The objective is to maximize after-tax profit. When you focus on maximizing after-tax profit, it's important where you cut costs, right? A penny saved is not the same depending on the region where you save that penny. And so the question is, can we design a model that will allow us to take advantage of different tax rates in different regions? So this is a manufacturer of building materials. They sell two different types of products, low grade and high grades. Right now, or when this work was done, they had one manufacturing facility in Ohio. You can see annual fixed cost and variable manufacturing cost. 4 distribution centers in Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Atlanta, and Reno. And the distribution strategy is relatively straightforward. Inbound is done using truckload carriers, and outbound is done with a combination of truckload carrier and less than truckload carriers. Here is a supply chain strategy, relatively simple. One manufacturing facility, 4 distribution centers in order to find the right balance between economies of scale and the ability to respond effectively to customer demand. A lot of pressure to improve bottom line, and so the company was considering investing or starting manufacturing activities either in Mexico or in Poland or in both. Different, of course, information about these potential facilities. You can see information here on cost in Mexico, significantly lower than cost in the US, and the tax rate is significantly lower than the tax rate in the US. Poland, the cost is a little bit higher than the one in Mexico. Of course, you need to account for a higher transportation cost, but tax rate is lower than the one in Mexico. When you look at Poland, while the manufacturing cost is higher than the one in Mexico, it's still significantly lower than the one in the US. And so the question is, what is a combination of lower manufacturing cost, lower tax rate, but higher transportation costs will do to this supply chain? We analyzed a couple of scenarios. Let me start with the first one, where we just focus on minimizing total supply chain cost. Forget about tax-efficient supply chain. Just focus on what companies have done for many years. Try to cut costs as much as possible. When you do that, you realize that it's not appropriate to incorporate the manufacturing facility in Eastern Europe because of the high transportation cost. But what is appropriate is to focus on Mexico and some manufacturing in the US because of the right balance between production cost and transportation cost. And when you do that, if you move manufacturing activities to Mexico, you increase bottom line, you increase profit by about 28%. That's great. The question is, what will happen if we start looking at maximizing after-tax profit? Here, of course, the challenge is to understand carefully what is the transfer price that you can use in the model. When you do that, here is what you get. You get that all manufacturing activities, and this is the work that was done relatively recently, all manufacturing activities move completely out of the country, out of the US, some to Mexico and some to Poland, and the impact on bottom line is about 40% relative to the baseline. And so when you think about supply chain strategies, when you think about transportation costs and all the other drivers that we analyze, different taxation policies have an enormous impact on supply chain strategies. And in my opinion, right now, with the current gaps that we have between what we see here and what we see in other countries, a lot of time for a lot of companies, not everybody, for a lot of companies, there is a huge wall preventing companies from coming back all the way to the US, which drives the following questions. I motivated, hopefully, a discussion about a move from the current strategy to a more regional manufacturing strategy. The question is, can we identify industries where we are going to see a move closer to market demand? Let me start with an example. This is TV manufacturer Sharp that announced recently that the company is moving manufacturing facilities from Asia to Mexico to serve customers in North and South America. And they identified two drivers of this decision. One is cutting transportation costs, and the other one is reducing lead time from 40 days when manufacturing is in Asia to 7 days when it's in Mexico. And the reason this is important specifically in this industry is because the price of TV, the selling price of TV dropped significantly during a lead time of 40 days. And so when we think about industries that will move from offshoring to nearshoring, we need to think about the transportation impact, right? What is the impact of logistics and transportation costs on total supply chain cost, and how easy or difficult it is to move infrastructure around. When transportation impact is high, we are already seeing a lot of move to regional strategies in TVs, refrigerator, appliances in general, the automotive industry, furniture. But when the transportation impact is low, while the cost of moving infrastructure is high, we don't see much move. And examples here include mobile phone and PCs, where there is enormous infrastructure that has been built over 20 years in Asia, and it would be very difficult to move this to a more regional strategy. In fact, think about the following exercise. Take some of this product and start looking down at the component level. You will see many components where most of the IP has been developed not in this country, but in Asia. And so this is going to be very difficult to change in the next few years. And finally, when transportation impact is low and the cost of moving infrastructure is low, we are already seeing some moves. This is nicely illustrated. The move to a regional strategy is nicely illustrated with an example of Honeywell. Honeywell was one of the first companies in 1980s to be invited to start activities in China in the 90s and the early 2000s. It was all around low-cost manufacturing. But starting from 2004, 2005, the company focused on a new strategy where R&D and product development for emerging markets is done in China. For China is done in China. This is what Honeywell called a change in their strategy from west to east to a new one, which they refer to as east to east. And now they are focusing on what they refer to as BCC, which is best in class against all local Chinese companies. One example that illustrates this nicely is a new product introduced by their team in Asia for the local market. This is a new gas turbo engine for micro car and van markets, focusing on characteristics of local markets. fuel efficiencies, the ability to carry more load, the pressure to focus on low-cost cars. And in 2010, the company sold in Asia more than 120,000 units of that product. So here is an example of Asia for Asia, North America, Europe for European market. The other development that we need to remember is that in the last few years we have seen significant decline in the price of domestic natural gas. In fact, between 2008 and 2012, the price of natural gas dropped by a factor of between 4 and 5. When you had that type of decline in the price of natural gas, it of course provides an advantage to US manufacturers that are heavily users of natural gas. I'm listing here a couple of examples: chemicals, fabricated steels, transportation equipment, and the like. And so let me close with a recent survey that we conducted a few months ago, trying to understand whether companies are actively focusing on changing their manufacturing strategies and perhaps moving them back to the US. We collected data from 125 different companies. You can see different sizes. Some are relatively small size, some are mid-size, and some are large-size companies. When we asked them, what are your challenges for 2012, it was mostly around business growth and cost reduction. When we asked them, are you actively considering the return of any manufacturing to the US? Of course, there is a difference between considering and actually moving, but at least focusing on considering, about 40% said we are considering moving manufacturing facilities to the US. And when you ask why, it's all about total landed cost. It's the hidden costs that most companies typically did not take into account when they started moving manufacturing facilities to Asia. And this is starting to bite their supply chain because of the increase in labor costs, because of the change in logistic costs, and a lot because of the risk faced by their supply chain. Let me close with 3 observations. At least the data that we have suggests a move to a regional strategy that allows you not only to control cost effectively, but also to manage risk in a better way. There was a question earlier in the day whether this is the end of lean. This is not suggesting the end of lean. This suggests that still companies are focusing on lean, but they need to rethink their manufacturing and supply chain strategies, trying to manage risk more effectively, and in fact, try to understand where are they exposed to risk so that they can control it in an effective way. The changing role of emerging markets, I talked about this, and finally, public policy. Everybody talked about it, but I believe taxation policy makes an enormous difference in terms of your manufacturing strategy. And I will stop here.
Question.